Hello everyone, my name is Abayomi. You are welcome to the step-by-step.NET series. Today we'll be looking at the repository pattern. So let's get right into it. This is draw.io. I have this diagram representing an app without the repository pattern. So this is the client in our case. Let's say the postman, the mobile app, and the likes sends a request to the controller, to the business logic, and then and in turn, if you get a success or a failure, it goes back to the controller and back to the actor or the client in the form of a response body. But with the repository pattern, we have a data access layer that is abstracting the business logic away from the rest of the app. To demonstrate in via coding, I'll create a new folder called repo pattern. I'll seed into repo pattern. Then let's open with our VS Code. Yes, I trust this author console. So let's create a new sln.net new sln. Inside our current folder, we have this file. Then let's create .NET new web API. The output folder should be repo pattern.api. As simple as that. Then if you build your project, you have this warning, .NET build. You have unable to find a project to restore. So we'll do .NET sln add ** wildcard *.cs proj. Then if you build again, you should have success. So let's bring in I'll seed into the repo pattern, the repo pattern.api. Then let's install the package that we will need. I'll do .NET add package ND framework called server, ND framework called .SQL Server. Let's bring in the tools. .0.0, then tools design quickly, command clear. Let's do design, and lastly I'll bring in the core. Let's bring in the core. So in the repo pattern.api project, I'll create 3 folders: data, models, and repositories. So we have these 3 created. In my models, I'll create a new class called player. Then so do prop. A player should have an ID prop, Jesse number, then do prop, should have a name of string, call this guy a string, public required string. Then lastly, let's duplicate this guy and call it club. So format my code. Then in my assets layer, I'll create a new appdb context. Then we get it from the db context. Quickly, we create our constructor. We have db context options. Then we pass in appdb context. We close. We call this options. Then we extend it to the base options. Then we can declare our db set here. Public, make it virtual for lazy loading. db set. We call this player and it's called players in our db. We declare the get set. Cool. Then in our let's add this. Let's clean up our project.cs. I'll remove all these comments. Bring in builder.services.add db context. Then we bring in our app db context, we close this guy, then we do options, lambda options dot use SQL Server, then we do builder dot configuration. Let me drop this guy down. Configuration dot get connection string. Cool. Open bracket, we call it default connection. Then I will set this guy, the connection string inside my app.db, app setting.json, I mean, connection string, paste this here. Then you can have your connection string here, like the server equals to local host, port should be 1433, then the user ID should be SA, then password should be your password, post star here. Then you can have the DB database we call it player DB, the player DB. Then also you can pass these options here: encrypt, false, trust server, and so on. So the next thing to do is to create our repositories folder. Call this one repositories. Do you have one here? Okay, we have it already. Then we can create our interface. I'll call it iPlayer repository. This is the contract of whatever function that we want to write or method that we want to write. So I'll call this guy task return API response. So let's have our custom API response. Then we do create player, we pass in player DTO, we call this guy player DTO. So we need to create two things to class the API response. I'll come to my models, I'll create API response here. I'll do public string, let's do message will now be, I have the get and set. Let's duplicate it 2 times. We call this int status code. We call this data, and data should be an object. So the return type should be an object. Let's create our parameterized constructor, setor API response. We call this string message, with a small m, string int of status code. Then lastly we have objects of data, and this can be null. That's fine. We can now do message equals to the small message. We have this status code equals to this status code, and lastly we have the data equals to data. Cool. So let me just give it a null for giving. Then in so let's bring this guy in for my models. Then our player DTO, let's create that quickly. I'll create a new folder called DTOs. I'll create another folder called request. Then in our request, let's create this class called DTOs. So we want to add some certain fields from our player. On the client side, I'll paste these guys there. Public int just a number string club. Cool. Then let's bring the DTO here. Simple as that. Then we want to create our implementation class. I'll call it player repository. Then we can implement the interface here. iPlayer repository bring this guy in and implement. Then let's pass in our DB context private readily I app DB context, call it context. Then we create our constructor, generate a constructor in the player, and we call this async. We make this async new player equals to await player, equals to new player, and we can have this, close this. The same player string must be set on object. So let's go to our model DTU. Okay, this should be not be string. There's a mistake here. To our player, so just a name, club. What should we call this? Let's call this name. So this should be name. I'll call this name too. So you're just saying the name should be set. I'll come here, I'll do name equals to our player DTU dot name coming from the client. Then the club should be player DTU dot club. Then what else do we have in our DTU? Then just a number 2. I'll pass the just number here equals to player DTU dot just a number. Then let's add await context dot player dot add async. Then we pass in our new player, then we end, then we do await context dot save changes async, because we have a tax awaitable here and asynchronous operation. Then we close. Then we can return a new API response. Then we call the message should be player created. Then status should be, let's do a casting of HTTP status code dot created. Then the last one should be the new player, as simple as this. Then let's create another folder called controllers. Then we create an API controller. Quickly, we call it players controller. Then we inject do private read-only our iPlayer repository. We call it underscore repo. Then we create a constructor from this, generate a constructor. Then we have HTTP post, then public async returner, async task. We do action results. We call this create player. We have our binding here. We call this create player request. Is that the name? Let's call this guy object. So we bring this create player request from okay, we call it player DTU. We called it player DTU. Yeah, DTU. So let's create a response. Response equals to await repo.create player. Then we pass in our object here. Then we can do return okay. Then pass in our response. Yeah, simple as that. Then in our program, let's inject our service. Let's do a bit of cleanup here. We don't need the weather forecast. I'll remove the weather forecast map. Get here the summaries, remove. Then let's add our app dot use controller or map controllers. Controllers. Then we had our builder.services.add controllers here. Format this guy. Then also let's bring in let's inject builder.services.add scoped. Then we bring in our iPlayer repository, then player repository. We close this. So let's run our migration.net. Add migrations.add. I'll call it initial _ 01. Let's see what we'll get. .net. Oh, I missed the ef.net. ef add migrations add initial _ 01. Then we click on it. Enter. So we have build done. Then .net ef database updates. We pass this guy. It's saying culture not found exception. So to remove this, I'll go to my CS proj. I'll turn this invariant to false. So I'll run it again. .net add, and this will create a migration folder and our raw SQL commands. Cool. Now let's do .net run. Let's test this. .net run. Then click on the 5226. Then add, then add swagger /index.html. Then let's create a new player. The JSON number is 12. I'll call it Ronaldo. Club is let's give it Arsenal. Arsenal execute. We should have player created. Let's call this 201. Data is ID 1, this number, and so on. Just to confirm the player created in our database, out Ctrl+Shift+P, go to this extension. Let's create. Let's add a new SQL Server. I had my password here. So click on connect. We have this player DB here. This is the player DB that I created. Then if you click on the DBO, database object, we should have our players here. Then you click, you have our 1, Ronaldo, 12, Arsenal. So let us do one more endpoint. I'll go to my API repository. Let's get task. I'll do API response. Do get all players. This will not have any parameter. I'll go to the implementation class, implement the interface. Then I'll turn this guy to async. Then var players equals to the await context.players dot to list async. Then we can do this. Then we can return new API response and do all players. Then we have a cast of HTTP status code .ok. Then we can pass a list of players. These players here. Okay, even pass players. Then in our controller, I would duplicate this. and change this guy to get. Change this to all players. Remove the object here. I'll call the response get all players, and that will be all. Let's give it a try. .NET run. Go back to the browser, refresh, try it. We have just one. If I create another one, call this number 10, call this J Kocha. Let's give it Liverpool. Let's give it Liverpool. Then if I click on execute, we have a list of players coming from here. The ID of the first one is 1, second one is 2. Let me know in the comment section what you feel can be improved on or things you would like me to create. See you in the next class.